I think I will begin. It's just a few minutes after 9:45, and I want to welcome everyone to this really important and exciting session because it is a very forward-looking opportunity to think about the future of education research at the Institute for Education Sciences, and a happy birthday, 20th birthday for IES. And yes, happy birthday, right? We are web streaming this session, so we want to not only welcome those of you who are place-based in San Diego, as we've learned to say, but also those of you who have joined us, many thousands who are with us through the virtual only part of the platform. It really is a pleasure as your executive director. I am Felice Levine, and I love chairing the sessions in our research and science policy series, and in particular this one, because we have a kind of a long-standing collaboration with the National Academies, where each year we feature a number of important reports and forward-looking reports that help us as a field and help agencies as a field think ahead about both what we have accomplished, the significance of what we have accomplished, and what we together can do to tackle important questions and issues that have significant education and education research policy issues, policy relevance. So I suppose I should start by a special thank you to Mark Schneider, our commissioner, director of IES, that's right, and former commissioner of NCS in the early part of this century, right? And I want to say, as someone who directs, it's not so easy to ask another independent body for advice and counsel. And that always is something that when an agency does that, whether it is IES or the National Science Foundation, that already says a lot about the agency and the person who undertakes that. So thank you, Mark, for doing that, recognizing the importance of the first 20 years and the next 20 or 30 or 50 thereafter. This report comes at an important time. We could not have anticipated what the last 2 years have been like, the COVID-19 pandemic, how IES and other fine federal funding agencies have needed to pivot. It's affected so many aspects. I mean, it's almost trite for me to say that and to take airtime to say how many aspects of learning have been affected, the whole institutional structure, the digital divides, the stratification of who gets what and who doesn't, the non-school factors, the health factors that have influenced academic outcomes and socio-emotional senses of well-being that were always issues that we're struggling with, have been tremendously amplified since what is now, some begin to talk about it as 3 years, but of course, chronologically, it's only been 2 years since March 2020. We still have much to learn from the pandemic, meaning that IES has even more essential role in understanding the conditions on the ground and building the evidence that can shape policies and practices in education to foster more equitable outcomes. Many of the recommendations in the report tend to do just that, as they really seek to build upon IES's current strengths. This is no baby. After 20 years, there's been really tremendous strengths. It has just had a significant impact, not only on our research community, but also on significant and important applications in policy and practice. And I'm kind of a groupie around this topic, so I will not even try to elaborate because we've got an extraordinary panel, leaders who were served on the Academies panel on the future of education research at IES, and I won't therefore use this time to give my views of those recommendations and how we can bring them forward. We're really thrilled to take this opportunity, have you here, and we hope those of you who are attending virtually, this will be recorded, so it will be in our on-demand library on the platform, and likely one that we will be featuring thereafter. So I just want to briefly say how thrilled I am once again to have the opportunity to introduce Adam Gamarin, who's the president of the W.T. Grant Foundation, who chaired this eminent committee. It probably goes without saying in this group, the quality of mind and scholarship of Adam as a knowledge producer and a knowledge leader, and how that has shaped what he's doing in public service in committees like this, and in his leadership role in W.T. Grant Foundation is really quite extraordinary. And as an old friend, I really appreciate that kind of work and that kind of commitment. At his immediate right is Beth Timpton, who we can all say thank you for being co-chair of the 2022 annual meeting, and also being willing to be on the IES panel simultaneously. She is Associate Professor of Statistics, co-director of the Statistics for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice Center, and faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. And at her immediate right is, I suppose I could say, one of my bosses, because Janelle Scott, among other roles, is a vice president of AERA for the division of policy and ed policy and politics. Thank you. Shouldn't miss the second half, but in her own right, she's an extraordinary scholar, a professor in Robert C. and Mary Catherine Bergenow Distinguished Chair in Educational Disparities at the University of California at Berkeley in the Graduate School of Education, African American Studies Department, and Goldman School of Public Policy. She is also currently serving, as I've just said, as AERA Division LVP for Educational Policy and Practice. I've already said a few words about Mark, and Mark and I go kind of way back. He may not even remember, but he once tried to lure me to when he was chair of a department at Stony Brook. So I was in my teens, but and so I thought I should finish my doctorate at that time. So it's always a pleasure. Right, I know. So it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to repartee with Mark. But to his credit, he has asked to expand our panel to exactly where it should be, to two of our colleagues who scientists in government are just extraordinary persons, and two of our absolutely best are Joe McLaughlin, who is the commissioner of the National Center for Special Education Research, and she'll kind of chime into and help field questions that we want to come from you. And Liz Albro, commissioner of the National Center for Education Research. We spend a lot of time hanging out together, and we want you to be part of that conversation. And with that, I want to turn this over to a leader and a partner and our leader for this session.
Thank you so much, Felice, for that incredibly warm and well-informed introduction. For 2 decades, IES and the U.S. Department of Education has provided leadership in education research for the nation. It's the 2 research centers within IES, the National Center for Education Research and the National Center for Special Education Research, known as NCSER, have funded research through open competitions. IES and its centers operate through their founding legislation, the Education Sciences Reform Act, or ESRA, passed in 2002 and amended in 2004. As IES approaches its 20th anniversary, the Institute asked the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to convene an expert committee to provide input from constituents, including researchers, policymakers, practitioners, on the future of IES's work. The ensuing report contains 19 recommendations. If these recommendations are followed, NCER and NCSER will build on their legacy of accomplishments, meet the moment today, lay the groundwork for the future in which education research is more useful and influential than ever before. As Felice stated, we are at a crucial moment for this report as we emerge from a devastating pandemic that has not only disrupted learning for all students, placed incredible stress on parents, teachers, learners, and educators, and exposed and exacerbated inequality in unprecedented ways. High quality, relevant research is part of the solution to these challenges. That's exactly the mission of IES, and in particular, NCER and NICSR. So this report is timely. Our specific charge included 4 elements: to identify critical problems or issues on which new research is needed, to show new methods or approaches for conducting research that should be encouraged and why, to show new and different types of research training investments that would benefit IES, and to answer the question of how best to organize a request for applications issued by the research centers to reflect those problems and issues. The committee formed to respond to those 4 elements represents a broad range of expertise. Many committee members are here today, not only the 3 of us on the stage, but in the audience, and express my tremendous gratitude for the hard work of the committee. Committee represents expertise in education policy, methods and statistics, educational leadership, educational technology, cognition and learning, social emotional learning, early learning, training of education researchers. It crosses general education and special education. 40% of the committee members are former practitioners in K-12 education. Sources of evidence included examined by the committee included the research literature, documentation of IES processes, testimony of experts, and written submissions from organizations representing dozens of groups and literally thousands of individuals, as well as 5 background papers that were commissioned by the committee. The committee, of course, also brought to bear its own judgments and experiences to identify the new priorities for education research at IES. As we began our deliberations and consideration of evidence, it was clear we needed to consider how education and education research had changed in the 20 years since IES was initially founded, including developments in education research that could inform a renewed set of priorities for today and the future. The committee identified 5 themes that cut across the 4 elements of our charge. The first is equity. Inequality has always been the fundamental challenge of US education, and the pandemic and the ensuing racial reckoning have brought this into even sharper relief. And equity has always been central to IES, as Ezra emphasizes improving education for all children and closing the achievement gap. To understand equity, the committee examined President Biden's executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities. And that provided us with a common language to think about equity. A second cross-cutting theme was technology in education. This is also central to IES since its founding legislation. It's called out explicitly in Ezra. Obviously, much has changed over the past 20 years, changes that have been accelerated by the pandemic. And also have been informed by IES, much IES-supported research. A third theme was the use and usefulness of education research. Major advances in understanding how education decision makers use evidence and how to make evidence more useful have occurred in part through funding from IES. We now understand that the use of evidence is a multi-directional, non-linear process that involves both producers and users of education research, and has a key role for intermediaries that often knit together the producers and consumers of evidence. Research that is grounded in specific needs and experiences of communities, research has told us, have greater likelihood of being used. And this evidence also informed the committee's deliberations. Heterogeneity is another defining feature of the education landscape. Variation occurs at all levels, including variation in treatment effects. So heterogeneity was a primary concern of the committee across all 4 of its charges. Of course, IES has been very attentive to heterogeneity over its 20 years. And the committee's recommendations here are really more about systematizing and bringing coherence to practices and ideas that IES has already been pursuing. Finally, the 5th theme is implementation and systemic change. NCER and NICSER research make clear that the success of interventions depend on their implementation. And so increasing the centrality of implementation in funded research seems like an important goal. Now, the first task, element of our task that we took up was to examine critical problems or issues on which new research is needed. NCER and NICSER fund research. The main research competitions in NCER and NICSER are shaped by a matrix of project types by topics. And so we examine the project types and topics in 2 separate chapters. And I'll turn it over to Beth Tipton to talk about the first of these project types.
Thank you, Adam. NCER and NICSER currently fund research through 5 project types. These project types follow the development of an intervention through a pipeline that begins with early exploration and development, through the testing of the intervention in schools, and finally, if successful, the adoption in schools. These project types have been a part of the organization for at least 15 years. And as such, the committee felt that they had played a normative role in how education research is conducted. Unfortunately, our report shows that there are several leaks, some very large leaks in this pipeline, leading to research that is not as impactful as we hope it could be. Based on testimony given by organizations working with schools and teachers, as well as researchers and policymakers, we propose a new set of project types. And I want to be clear that these build upon 20 years of research and knowledge that we have gained as a community. So we're ready to create project types that are really based upon our experience in education and our field of education. In this new organization, studies would fall into one of 4 new types. For now, I'm putting aside measurement, discovery and needs assessment. This first project type, well, I'll tell you more about that in a second. The next one is development and adaptation, impact and heterogeneity, and knowledge mobilization. And again, I will return to talking about measurement in a little bit. We provide 3 recommendations here, I believe, or no, one recommendation here. And this recommendation I'm going to go over in detail. So the first project type is discovery and needs assessment. It includes studies that focus on assessing the needs and assets found in schools and educational contexts throughout the United States. Some of this type begin by asking schools and communities about their own perceptions of what questions they need to have answered so they can serve all of their constituents. These studies would ask questions like, what types of interventions are needed? What problems are schools facing, particularly now, given the last couple of years, that need urgent study? What promising practices are some schools developing that could be scaled and shared elsewhere? Based upon these needs, possible new interventions are developed through the second project type, development and adaptation. Interventions such as curricula, educational technologies, teaching strategies, the wide variety of intervention types that IES currently funds, need to be able to be adapted to the range of communities found in our country. Interventions that show promise here would then move through the pipeline to the impact and heterogeneity project type. Here, these new ideas would be tested in the full range of schools and communities in need, with a focus on determining if these interventions improve learning, and if so, under what conditions they work best. This new project type combines what has previously been separated into efficacy, effectiveness, scale up, and replication into a single project type, thus accelerating the pace at which interventions can be vetted. The final project type, knowledge mobilization, is what truly solves the leaky pipeline problem. This new project type involves researchers studying head-on what it takes to get research to practice. This includes the best approaches and avenues to conveying which interventions are scientifically tested and which are not. This also involves the development of tools for making it easier for schools and policymakers to access research. From here, I'm going to pass this now to Janelle.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Adam. So we're going to turn now to our focus, continuing on this theme of critical problems and issues, turn to topics. And following the theme that my colleagues have set, we approach this with an acknowledgement of the strengths already existing within IES with regard to topics. We think they do a good job representing the field, and particularly in the way that the topics intersect with project types. We think that poses some challenges. So let's talk about that for a minute. We have 5 recommendations that emanate out of our assessment of the current topics that IES takes up. We think that the emphasis on student outcomes has meant that there are studies that might focus on other outcomes in the system, and these studies that are very critical for our holistic understanding of problems of policy and practice are not well understood because they're not perceived as eligible for funding. We think that the topic areas can be more readily studied. The fact that topic areas that can be more readily studied with causal designs, large samples, randomized interventions, are viewed as more competitive by reviewers. And as a result, some of the more pressing topics we think perhaps have not received support or focused attention. And so that leads to a set of 5 recommendations in the report. So recommendation 1 for NCR and NICSR. We think that there are existing constraints and priorities in the RFA structure and review process that has necessarily narrowed the kinds of studies within topics that get proposed and ultimately funded. And we think in order to expand these studies that are successfully proposed and funded, IES might consider some things. First, allowing the use of outcomes beyond student level ones, which does not mean we're going to let go of student level outcomes. Those remain important, we know that, but we'd like them to be in conversation with other metrics. So things like classrooms, schools, institutions, and districts being considered as primary outcome foci of study. We think it's important to expand the choice of research designs in relation to that, in tandem with that expanded focus for addressing research questions that are process related, focusing on why and how and for whom and under what conditions interventions work. And then we think within each of its existing and future topic area competitions, IES should emphasize the need, as Adam talked about, for research focused on equity and really taking the theme of equity that's quite present and really emphasizing it, given what we all know has been revealed over the last several years. So in order to encourage some areas that we think are responsive to these urgent current needs that are likely to persist for some time, and we think are somewhat neglected in the existing funding portfolio, that NCR and NICSR might consider some very specific topics for addition. This would include the effects of civil rights policies and practices on equitable opportunities to learn for all students, It would include serious study of teacher education and workforce development, knowing the very critical and central role of teachers in opportunity structures within schools and schooling systems. And it would include a systematic focus on the use of educational technology and learning analytics to enhance opportunities to learn and rigor and quality of education. Again, given what we know about the central role of technology, not only within the pandemic, but beyond. We also recommend some new research competitions under NICSR around these topics. Teaching practices associated with improved outcomes for students with disabilities. Classroom and school contexts and structures that support access and inclusion for students with disabilities. And finally, issues specific to low incidence populations in terms of disability. Our final recommendation is that IES implement a systematic, a periodic, a transparent process for analyzing the state of the field and to be more dynamic about adding and removing topics in response to field-based needs. And so we suggest some ideas for how to do that. We suggest the development of mechanisms to engage with a broad range of stakeholders to identify needs. We suggest that we develop systematic approaches for identifying areas where research is lacking by supporting research syntheses and creating evidence maps and obtaining input from practitioners and researchers. And finally, to enhance the public-facing communication with the field about how priority topics are being identified. So I am going to now turn it back to Beth, who's going to walk us through our recommendations around methods.
Thank you, Janelle. In addition to research on schools, students, and interventions, NCER and NICSR also provide funding for research on methods and measures that facilitate this larger research agenda. Here, it is important to note that while we combined these two into a single chapter of our report, they are funded through different mechanisms. Measurement studies are considered to be a project type and cross-cut topics. Method studies are considered separately from project types, topic structure, and instead have their own RFA. As part of our statement of task, we sought to understand the types of methods and measures that are needed to facilitate the project types and topics that we just discussed. The committee came to consensus on two recommendations regarding methods. First, in centering the needs of decision makers and communities, methods are needed regarding the following areas. Small causal studies. This is particularly important when there are subgroups or communities that are not large and yet are super important for us to understand what works in these communities. Understanding implementation and adaptation. Again, we can't change practice through interventions if people aren't using them. Understanding knowledge mobilization. There will be methodological developments needed here. Predicting causal effects in local contexts. There's a lot of talk about wanting to be able to provide schools and decision makers with predictions of, will this intervention work here or not? That requires a different kind of statistical framework and a different kind of methodological development than what we are currently doing. And utilizing big data. We know that particularly from ed tech, there's a lot of big data now available and administrative data, and that these are places in which we should be figuring out how to leverage these and perhaps even combine them with causal data. Our second recommendation is that the committee felt strongly that in order to answer questions of how and why, quantitative methods alone were just not enough. Instead, the committee recognized that this is exactly where qualitative research methods and ultimately mixed methods work could shine. And so NCER and NICSR currently do not fund methods research regarding the development or study of qualitative or mixed methods. In the future, we recommend that there is a new review panel added that focuses specifically on these areas. Moving on to measures, the committee also reviewed carefully the types of measures that have been funded to date and sought to understand where there might be gaps moving forward. This led to a third recommendation focused on measures. In order to support the recommendations for revitalized project types and topic structures, new measures are needed. These include expanding the range of student outcome measures available. Already there's a lot of measures, in sort of behavioral measures and non-achievement outcomes, but we would like to expand that further. Developing and validating measures beyond the student level. These are structural and contextual factors. For example, teacher outcomes, knowledge mobilization, what does it mean to be using evidence? For example, how would you measure that or know if it was being used? Developing and validating measures related to educational equity. What does equity look like? Currently, we can only do that at the individual level based upon student test scores, but that's not telling us much about the environment, the inputs to the system. And using technology to develop new approaches and tools for measurement. We, in the last couple of years, have spent a lot of time online. And so thinking about how does that change how we measure educational and school outcomes. Okay, returning to the statement of task, we were also asked to comment on training. This is an area in which we were universally positive in our review. Over the past 20 years, IES has made tremendous investments in training, including pre-doctoral programs, postdoctoral programs, and workshops. And I want to be clear that many of our committee members had been involved in one or more of these experiences, myself included. In being forward-looking, we looked to how to continue and improve this investment. And this led to 4 recommendations. The first recommendation is that IES needs to develop some indicators of success for training and collect them from programs. And we need to make that information publicly available. So this involves understanding what does it mean for a program to be successful, and so what does it mean for it to not be successful, as well, right? The second is IES should build on its current strengths in methods training and expand in the following areas. So these are methods training is often through workshops that are funded. Methods to address questions of how and why policies work. Methods that use machine learning, predictive analytics, natural language processing, administrative data, and the like. These newer methods and how can they be of use to our field? Oops. Our third recommendation is kind of in the spirit of the first recommendation, which is that IES needs to collect and publish information on the racial, ethnic, gender, disability status, disciplinary and institutional backgrounds of applicants and participants in training. And this is truly important in order to keep a monitor on the field to know how these training investments and for whom it's working and where there are gaps moving forward so that you could fill those gaps. Finally, IES should implement a range of strategies to broaden participation in these trainings to increase and achieve greater diversity in the racial, ethnic, and institutional background of participants. These strategies might include implementing targeted outreach to underrepresented institution types, supporting early career mentoring, requiring that training program applicants clearly articulate a plan for being inclusive and equitable in their programming, and offering supplements to existing research grants to support the participation of individuals from underrepresented groups. Some other grant agencies do this kind of work. I think from here, I'm now going to pass this. Oh, and finally, funding short-term research opportunities for undergraduate and graduate students. Okay, returning to the statement of task, I'm going to bring us back to Janelle.
Okay, we're at the last one. So as we've noted, we also were charged with thinking and reflecting about the request for application process, the RFA process, particularly as it related to the problems and issues that our committee had identified. And so I am going to talk about that now. Again, we first assessed what we found to be the strengths of existing IES practices and policies. And we thought that one of the core strengths in this area was the explicitness of the RFAs. It's very clear what IES is looking for in applications. We did see room for opportunity and growth and development. And as we have already stated when Adam introduced our process, we drew this assessment from our testimony from particularly from other funders about how they approach funding with equity and heterogeneity in particularly in mind, from our assessment of IES data and from other public commentary. And so we identified some areas where we think there's opportunity for improvement. First, we found that IES does not publicly and systematically share information on its applicants as yet, its reviewers and its grantee, and it makes it impossible then to track whether the application and review process is resulting in an equitable distribution of grants that ultimately reflects the knowledge and strength of the field. We also came to the conclusion and the consensus that our current procedures don't provide IES with sufficient information to assess the impact of potential projects and the extent to which the sum total of these projects collectively cohere as a program of research that might move our field and move equity and opportunity across systems of education. And finally, we found that the lengthy timelines coupled with just one opportunity per year to compete for funding was posing significant challenges for researchers and their school district and other partners. And so out of that assessment, we developed 4 recommendations that I'll walk through. So the first recommendation is to regularly collect and publish information on the racial, ethnic, gender, disciplinary, and institutional backgrounds and funded PIs and co-PIs, the composition of review panels and study samples. And we see a bit of that, and that's good. And we just want to enhance and deepen that. Our next recommendation is about the review and funding process itself. And so we suggest that IES review and fund grants more quickly and to reintroduce 2 application cycles each year. Our third recommendation is around partnerships and collaborations. And so we suggested that IES include the collaboration with LEAs and SEAs. With that regard, the request for application should require that applicants explain the rationale and preliminary plan for collaboration in lieu of the current requirement for a letter of support. Upon notification of a successful award, grantees must then provide a comprehensive partnership engagement plan and letters of support in order to receive the funding. And this comes from our desire to really deepen the connection between research and practice. And our last recommendation with regard to RFAs is to engage a working group representing practitioner and policymaker communities along with members of the research community to develop realistic mechanisms for incorporating practitioner and policymaker perspectives in the review process systematically and across multiple panels. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to our leader, Adam, to bring us home.
Thanks, Janelle and Beth. To achieve the vision of these recommendations, it is critical to address transparency in the funding process and constraints caused by IES's relatively modest budget. These 2 enabling recommendations are essential if IES is to fulfill the promise for its future that we've laid out in the preceding 17 recommendations. The first is that NCER and NICSR should conduct a comprehensive investigation of the funding process to identify possible inequities. This equity review is essential because at present we have almost no data on the distribution of funding across investigator backgrounds and institutional backgrounds. The little data that we do have suggests that there are disparities. What the source of the disparities are, we don't know. What remedies might be possible, we don't know. So a comprehensive equity review would help to address them. The second enabling recommendation is not a recommendation to IES. It's a recommendation to Congress. And I've already had the chance with some of my colleagues to brief four different congressional committees on these recommendations, including emphasizing this recommendation. Here, the committee knows that in order to achieve the overriding vision presented through these recommendations, IES needs additional investments. We were dismayed to learn about the modest size of IES's budget in comparison to the budgets of other scientific research agencies throughout the federal government. The modest size seems particularly unwarranted in light of the high degree of success that IES has demonstrated in pursuit of its mission, as outlined in the report. The committee recognizes that in the absence of additional funding, IES will need to make a series of challenging decisions related to how it will address the recommendations identified in the report. And for that reason, the committee recommends that Congress re-examine the IES budget, which does not appear to be on par with those of other agencies. I emphasize, many of the recommendations in the report can be implemented without additional funding, although they will cost staff time, which is an extremely scarce and precious resource within IES. But other recommendations, such as the return to 2 competitions a year, obviously will require substantial infusions of funding, and there should be new funding for research and new funding to allow these recommendations to be adopted. We are at a crucial moment, and we must respond along the lines recommended. We need to center equity as the focus of education research, in the way education research dollars are distributed, and in the way training opportunities are available. And we have to ground education research in the needs of communities, educators, and learners, because that's what will increase the chances that the research actually gets used. Thank you.
So we will now turn it over for a kind of a comment, I won't say response, but elaboration and thoughts from our IES colleagues. And I want to encourage you to begin thinking of yourselves as part of the Q&A and conversation, as well as those of you who are joining with us remotely. Use the Q&A and we'll try to bring your voices in. That's very much part of what we want to achieve together as we look to the future. So let me turn it over to, sorry.
Can I do that for you?
Yeah, I think it should be live and you can all speak from the.
Okay, good. Is this live?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So first of all, of course, I want to thank the panel. I want to thank Adam. I want to thank all the people that participated in this review process. So I asked for this review because it's the 20th anniversary year of IES, and we wanted to help us think about what the next few years were going to be. And as you may know, we did a NASM panel on NAEP and one on NCES, and those are actually, there's the discussion of the NAEP panels this afternoon and NCS is tomorrow. So for those of you who don't know what the model of NASM is, it's a perfect business model. They collect money from us. They don't pay these poor people, right? They demand endless amounts of hours. And they select people who are the best in the field, which means they have many other things that they could be doing, and they ask them to volunteer their time. And you could imagine how much time that involves. So I worked for AIR For 10 years, we were a consulting company, but we had to raise all our money by hustling and hustling. NASM is a consulting company with a congressional charter, and people just come to them and say, do this and do this, in part because they have a distinguished seal that they put on things. And it carries a lot more weight than anything I ever did at AIR or et cetera. So again, thanks to everybody, the 15 people, many hours of work, and giving up incredible amounts of opportunity cost to do that. So IES leadership, Joan and Liz included, have spent hours and hours and hours going through this incredibly dense and, quite frankly, incredibly long report. We've parsed it, we've discussed it. Staff in both centers have gone through it over and over and over again. I've read the report 3 times. And it's extremely, for me, and I think for most of us, it turned out to be an extremely difficult report just to go through and to identify in it the points that really matter, and trying to figure out exactly what's in it that is that we should and could work on in this year, next year, and in the long run. It was extremely difficult. And in a lot of times the lead was buried. So there are incredibly important things in this report, but finding them and understanding them and figuring out how to operationalize them was a lot of work, and we're not done. We're not even close to done. And we've had conversations, Liz and Joan and I have had conversations with members of the committee, of the panel. So we're not done yet. We're doing our due diligence. We're doing our investigation, but it is an incredibly difficult task because it is a consensus report, which is also part of the Academies report system. So when you get 15 first-class minds together, they all have a lot to say, and nobody wants to give up their words. So you do a consensus report and you just build bigger and bigger. So let me turn to some of the findings, some of the recommendations here. So we truly appreciate the concern for equity, right? And we particularly appreciate the fact that the committee recognizes that in our founding legislation, ESRA, equity is core, right? We called it equitable at the time. Equity was not the mot du jour, but everything in ESRA, not everything, but most things in ESRA are all concerned with unequal outcomes. And we think that the analysis rooting the concern for equity in ESRA is a much firmer foundation than talking about an EO, the executive order. Yes, executive orders are important, but they come and they go. ESRA has been around for 20 years, and the foundation for our concerns for inequality, inequities are based in legislation that probably needs to be reauthorized. It's long overdue and getting long in the tooth, but the fact of the matter is it's stable, sound congressional legislation that is extremely hard to change as compared to EOs, which come and go. So we appreciate the fact that at least a strong part of the analysis of equity, inequities are based on legislation rather than just the EO. Transparency in data. Okay, so transparency, of course, is a highly valued word, and we're all in favor of it. And by the way, and I'm sure that Liz and Joan will talk about this more, we are doing, and we have been working hard for before this report to try to figure out how to get more data on where our money's going, what it's buying, who it's supporting, right? And we could talk at length about the problems of broadening the research base and getting more institutions and universities involved in our research. But the fact of the matter is we're a science agency, and the pattern of the way in which money flows out of IES is not much different than NSF or NIH. And that is most money goes to a handful of universities, and within those universities, a handful of researchers. And we have been thinking really hard about how to broaden that. And we've been talking to the Spencer Foundation about trying to, broaden the representation of universities that have tried to get money that may be on the bubble. But, it's a really hard task. What happens when you try to recruit a California State University system where the teaching load is 8 courses, right? People don't have the time to devote to seeking money. right? And the universities are not set up to support research infrastructure. This is a serious problem. I hope Liz has some comments about how we're trying to broaden that. So then, okay, so we could document the problems, right? And actually just look around this room and take a look around. You can see that there is a problem. When we have our PI meetings, we could see that there's a problem in terms of ethnic representation. But what is the solution is a real problem. It's a real problem. So we have tried to diversify the pool of reviewers, and not only in terms of ethnic, gender is not much of a problem in this field, but in terms of ethnic and racial diversity, we've tried to broaden it, but we've actually done much more work in trying to bring in policymakers, for example, teachers, entrepreneurs. So all of you know what the problem is. When I left AIR, I had spent 10 years working with state legislators and state policymakers. And I've worked with a dozen states. I knew dozens of really, really good people in state governments. And I said, hey, look, we do support state work, right? And I said, why isn't she on this report, on this panel? Why isn't he on this panel? What, et cetera? And said, sure, let's go recruit them. And they all said the same thing. The legislature's in session. The governor needs me. I can't spend 3 days in Washington, D.C. on a review panel. I can't spend 5 days reviewing these proposals. I don't have the time. When we did the transformative research RFA, we brought in entrepreneurs. We brought in leaders of foundations. Same thing. Same thing. So to broaden the pool is a noble goal. It happens to be extremely difficult. Getting information, by the way, which we've been trying to collect data on the diversity of the field is, the panels and the review process turned out to be extremely difficult because we're a government agency and we need OMB approval to collect data. And most of the time, we've been collecting these data for some time, but it's voluntary, again, because we're a government agency, and about 30 to 40% of people just refuse or decline to supply information. So one of the points that was discussed was heterogeneity. So this is unbelievably important. This is really and truly important. We all recognize it. We all recognize the importance of it. We're in a continental-sized country, 14,000 school districts, amazing differences in terms of the makeup, the money, the decisions being made in across those 14,000 school districts and 110,000 schools. And I'm not even talking about, because the most of this report is about K-12 education, where I'm not even talking about community colleges, over 1,000 community colleges, 4,000 Title IV post-secondary institutions. I mean, we're talking about, an incredibly complicated system that is heterogeneous. So, the mantra of IES is what works for whom under what conditions. Well, what does that imply? That implies that we have to understand heterogeneous effects, because what works for whom under what conditions says that we need things that work for different conditions. So there's a long history at IES with RCTs, and the beginning of RCTs was focused on main effects. So the era of main effects was an error. It was wrong. And it was, in fact, even when Russ Whitehurst, a good friend of mine and my boss, was pushing this, he knew that it was wrong, right? I mean, medicine had moved from the main effects to individualized medicine, even when Russ was pushing the main effects, but he had to start someplace. But the era of main effects was wrong. It was an error. And we really do need to figure out better ways of incorporating heterogeneity at the very beginning, rather than trying to figure out what to do later on. So we have actually, and we made a mistake, it was my mistake, we actually encourage replication studies, but the replication studies they weren't main effects because they were trying to take an existing well, they were main effects, actually. They're trying to take something that worked and to replicate it in different geographies or among different demographics. But it was the same, quite frankly, my fault. It was the same broken model, 5 years, $5 million failure. So we're not going to do those anymore. We have to figure out some other way of supporting replications. Some of you may know about the X Prize competition that we are supporting, the digital learning platform, SeerNet, that we are supporting. And those are designed to put heterogeneity front and center, and those are designed to do rapid testing in different student groups and different geographies to try to figure out what works for whom, under what conditions. They're also designed to fail fast, which is incredibly important. Incredibly important, because most things fail. We spend 5 years failing when we should spend 5 months and know that something didn't work, and then figure out, okay, here's something that worked. Who did it work for? Let's replicate it and see if it could work in other groups, for other groups. That's the way we're approaching heterogeneity. And so Beth is, of course, one of the major advocates for heterogeneity. We talked about this, and we're trying to figure out how best to understand how to build heterogeneity right from the get-go. But this is the motivation of the X Prize, the motivation of SeerNet and other work is really designed to replicate in order to identify what works for whom, under what conditions. Knowledge mobilization. So this, I think, is a mistake on the committee's part, on the panel's part. So in discussions yesterday, we had a community listen and then here. So knowledge mobilization is an example of the committee, the panel bearing the lead. It's incredibly important. They told me it was incredibly important, and now I'm beginning to understand the vision and why it's incredibly important. But I read the report 3 times, and it didn't hit me how important knowledge mobilization is in their conceptualization. So I'm going to go back and read it a 4th time. But now I have a lens to look at, to try to understand better what knowledge mobilization means and what they're trying to do. So this is, again, an example of bearing the lead. Next, I only have 11 points, so I think we're up to 7. Okay, and I swear I wanted to save time for that, but I know, you know, like, so one of the advantages of getting old is that my voice doesn't work very well. And so I may run out of voice before I run out of points. So the discussion of qualitative research is, again, I think, buried the lead. So the part of that discussion that for me is the most interesting, and Beth pointed out, we had a 2-hour discussion yesterday, was that when IES started, the level of quantitative research, the kind of quantitative research that was being done was, I'm going to use the term primitive compared to what we have now, but we spent 20 years building that up. So I think we need to understand how we could do the same thing for qualitative research. But remember, our legislation requires us to do rigorous research. And quite frankly, at the current time, the standards for rigorous qualitative research, I don't know if they exist, but I think this is a task that we can and should be thinking about, because it is fundamentally important. EdTech is not a separate topic, despite the discussion here. It's not a separate topic. It's in everything. It is in everything. And we support EdTech everywhere, including the Small Business Innovation Fund, the research fund, SBIR. So some of our greatest successes have come through SBIR, which is, by the way, administered through NCER. So it could have been something to look at, but it's an amazingly effective, effective program. Field sensing, I agree. We need to figure out how better to find out what's going on in the field. So we do the School Pulse survey, but we need to figure out much better ways of doing field sensing. Infrastructure is sort of buried in here too, but infrastructure is incredibly important, because right now what happens is that we ask researchers to spend 80% of their time finding data, finding schools developing partnerships. And then finally, after they spend 80% of their grant money trying to recruit data and schools, they have like 20% left over. And then, as we all know, in the last year, they have to find more money. So this is this incredibly stupid process, right? I mean, it just makes no sense. So my vision is we turn this around so researchers spend 20% of their time finding data, finding partners, and 80% of the time doing the work. We have some ideas of how to do this. So we're developing like the investments in the X Prize and DLP, digital learning platforms, is an example of trying to build an infrastructure that will make large data sets available. And they will be open data sets. They will be available to many more people so that they could test their data. We're thinking about how to develop libraries of ethically sourced, approved data systems that are anonymized so that people could run their learning systems against that for training systems. We're talking about, as I said, data libraries. We're trying to figure out how better to expand the list of school districts that have researchers in them. And we're trying to figure out how better to expand the list of researchers who can do the work, right? And the model that we have in mind is the match that matches graduates from medical school with graduates from medical schools with hospitals that need them. And the algorithm for the match is well known. A Nobel Prize in 1984 was given for this. The algorithm is easy. It's trying to figure out what school districts need, what school districts want, what researchers have skills and are willing to do this, to do the match. So we're working, we have, I can't name the company, but we have a proposal that we're trying to figure out how to fund, if we want to fund, to do the match. The AI Institutes with the National Science Foundation, another example of what we're trying to do to expand the infrastructure. So again, some critical points, but some kudos and thank yous.
So are we gonna have just Joan and Liz? Are you gonna chime in a little bit?
Yeah.
Then we'll open it up and they can also field questions, of course.
Yes, that's great. We'll do that. Am I live? Okay.
You should be.
Thanks so much. And I want to add my thanks to the panel and everyone who really spent a lot of time and effort on this report. And there's much in it that we like. I, in particular, love the request for additional funding for NICSR. I can talk more about any of these things through questions, but I do want to say a couple of things. I want to talk to the people who are interested in special education that are listening to this, because when you read the report, there are many places where you won't see special education. They talk about the COVID era and or years and how much students have been affected by that. They don't talk about students with disabilities, how disproportionately they have been affected, how even legally mandated services couldn't be provided, you know, that kind of thing. They don't, in talking about the mission, in one chapter, they give NCER's mission, but not NICSR's. In another chapter, they give one of our 3 components of the mission. So there's a lot in here that doesn't speak specifically to special education. So what I want to tell people who are listening to me and read the report is that when IES is responding to this report, we will be thinking about special education and including it in the output that we do. And I also want to say one more thing, sorry. The other thing I want to say is that many of you know, and some of you may not know, that NICSR was the last to join IES because we were authorized through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And that's a civil rights piece of legislation. And that's always driven our work and continues to drive it. And so we, just by the nature of what we study, we do focus on civil rights. All right, thanks, Liz.
All right, guys, you've been listening very well and very patiently. I feel for you. I want to just say a couple things. Again, thank you to everyone. I know how hard this work is. And I know having had the privilege of supporting multiple NASM panels over the years in my own disciplinary area in cognition and in reading, I know it's a lot of work. And I know that you guys spent a lot of time and energy thinking about it. So I'm going to start with the last recommendation, the resources recommendation, just in terms of my reaction. So when I got to the end of the report and read it, I was like, why isn't that first? Because the reality is so much of this requires people. And Adam, I love that you say some of this is resource neutral except for staff time. So does anyone know how many staff we are actually talking about? I have a staff of 18, 13 of whom are program officers. So think about everything that all the asks that are here and how that divides out by individuals. Joan has a staff of 6.
I have 7, one of which is going to be leaving soon and another is part-time. And for many years, I had 3.5 represented by 4 people, but 1 worked part-time.
And our standards and review office, which manages peer review, they have, I think Ann's staff currently has 5. So we read this report through the lens of thinking about who is going to do the work. And I just want to acknowledge that, because that's really important. It's not just about the money that's available to fund the work, but it's also about who is actually going to make it happen. But I just have a 2 little things I wanted to throw out. We actually are just about ready to award a contract to do an assessment of our training programs. This is actually something we started on a while ago. It took us a while to find the resources and the time to do that, but I want to thank the committee for raising that up. It's something we care a lot about. And again, we haven't had sort of either the people resources or the financial resources to do it. And then the second thing, Mark mentioned the data set question and thinking about education and technology and what's available. I want everyone to keep their eyes tuned to the Federal Register. I know you guys spend a lot of time thinking about the Federal Register. It's like a really important thing, but we have a request for information that's going out, because one of the things we need is for the field to help us understand what data sets are actually available for use, right? We work with assumptions that these things are out there, but are they actually, right? We don't know. Wait, there was one more thing I wanted to say, now I lost it. I think that I know what the last thing is. The other thing to remember as we think about this, I love reading IES. We want IES to do this, but we're a field initiated organization. And so anything that we put out, whether it's competitions, whether it's requests for reviewers, requires the field to respond and to reply, right? So we don't use competitive priorities, but most of our work is pretty wide open. And what that means is that the community needs to apply. We don't have the opportunity to fund or support folks who don't apply to us. And so we're trying to figure out how to increase, as Mark talked about, how to broaden who comes in. But in many ways, what we do depends upon you. And so I just want to remind everyone that that's the way it is. So thanks. And I know you guys, I'm sure, have lots of questions. So we really appreciate all the work that everyone's done.
Let's invite to the microphone. Please come forward. And if you wouldn't mind saying just your name and your affiliation.
Bill Penuel, and I'm at the University of Colorado. I was also the principal investigator of one of the 2 funded centers in knowledge utilization, on which the director has been briefed a number of times. I was also a reviewer of this report, and I just want to begin by thanking you all for a very clear report and the presentation you just get. Yeah, let's do it. And my question is simple for Mark and Joan and Liz is, which recommendation will you implement first? Why? And on what time scale? Thanks.
So Bill, I think I just answered that.
Can we
Right.
have that mic a little louder on the right? Just wait a minute, Liz. I want to make
You
sure.
spoke to the last recommendation, which you said couldn't be.
The request for the
Okay.
assessment of the training
Okay.
programs, we are implementing that now. So that's the first one.
Okay,
just in terms
and
of-
how about, give us a second one, Liz.
A
Thanks.
second. Oh, I don't have a second. I only have a first. Sorry, Bill.
Hi, I'm Brahim Dahlstrom Hockey. I'm a senior research scientist with Turk Research Nonprofit in Cambridge, Mass. A lot of my work focuses on education for neurodiverse learners, and one of the challenges with working with IES is the split between NSER and NICSER, because I'm interested in work that bridges both, right? That's accessible to the majority of the classroom, but also inclusive of students with needs outside what's typically addressed in the classroom. Is there any movement towards trying to bridge that gap? I know there's different funding streams and there's difficulties from that perspective, but you know, it's challenging working in the field when you're trying to bridge that. You know, most of my funding is not through IES because of that.
What age range?
So I've previously mostly college, but now doing middle high school type work.
Yeah, college is the trickier one.
Yeah.
And happy to talk afterwards if you're interested, but
Sure.
before that, neurodiversity would come to us.
Okay.
Rajiv Das, Texas A&M University Senior Data Scientist. So I'm glad for this session because it's nice to know that IES is finally getting on board with the times. I guess it takes a while to turn a big lumbering ship. Public Law 11495, Every Student Succeeds Act, was advocating for using causal inference methods, experimental and quasi-experimental designs. And this was back in 2015. You're making these changes now. AERA has a position paper from 2009 about what constitutes quality research. And many sessions here fail to meet that standard. There's very little consideration for effect size, power analysis, sample size. Many presentations here use small sample size, and small samples lead to unstable results and possibly non-replicability. So if IES's goal is to, quote, provide national leadership in expanding fundamental knowledge and understanding of education, end quote, then I'm pleased. I ask that you simply follow through and keep study design rigor at the forefront. And you wonder why, if you step back, educational research has had so little impact on the state of education in the last 10, 20, 30 years in America. And it's because of these issues. So I hope the changes here begin to address the near irrelevance of educational research on educational outcomes in America, because education is what makes this country and the world great. It's all about education. So I'll be watching. Thank you.
I think you've framed an important issue, and starting with Adam, anyone who wishes to speak to that, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, I certainly share the goals you espouse, but I think you mischaracterize IES's role. I would not at all say that IES is late to the party in coming to this. As someone who has just spent the past 10 months examining IES, I can tell you that no institution has done more to elevate the quality and rigor of research on education. I would further assert that education research is not irrelevant, that it has been highly consequential in our school districts. And one of the big challenges that we lay before IES is increasing the usefulness, and impact of research. When IES was founded, the main strategy for increasing the impact of research was to produce better quality research. And they have done that. But what's needed now, it turns out, is to develop better strategies for getting evidence used. And that is where our knowledge mobilization recommendation comes from.
Others? Yes.
Hi.
If I could just also add that I was struck in the Evidence-Based Policy Commission report that one of the primary examples of research leading to policy and practical applications and implications was the leadership role of IES in the whole development of the state longitudinal administrative data systems as an illustration of what other agencies in other domains need to think about, and including partnerships with states. So let me just second what Adam said. I think we really need to understand what leadership can mean from the federal government, and the panel is trying to not have a rewriting of what's important. I think the PowerPoint set of recommendations is extraordinarily useful and is a very good place to begin a conversation with our federal leaders and our scientific community. So let me ask you to ask your question. And yeah. Sure.
So your concerns are actually well taken. It's like maybe you're the skunk at the garden party and it's like, okay, you raise some really important issues. Small sample size is a serious problem. Underpowered research is a serious problem. There's no question about it. And we're trying to figure out how to expand the size and access to large data sets that are useful. There was a passing reference and not enough discussion in the report about administrative data sets, the sources of data that are available are expanding exponentially. But we as a federal agency have incredible problems in terms of what kinds of data, what kinds of administrative data, what kinds of big data, what kinds of data that's generated from ed tech products that we can access and that we could use. Just a quick example. During COVID, when schools were closed, we were trying to identify which schools were open, which schools were closed, what was changing. Someone came to us with a proposal that said, I have access to cell phone data, right? So we know from cell phone data that 5 calls came from that school in that day. And in a normal day, we would have expected 100 calls. And then the next day, there may have been 25 calls. So just looking at the number of calls that were being generated from a school was giving indicators of how many students, how many people were in that school. And they said, we have the data, we just need, money to analyze it.
So I think we're in heated agreement. And so let me entertain the next question.
We could not
Mark,
touch that data.
Mark, we want to be sure everyone has an opportunity.
Hi, everyone. Chris Mazzio, Education Northwest. My question, and I haven't had a chance to read the full report, is about the funding issue. I'm curious how much the group has grappled with the idea that almost all funding goes to researchers, to institutions who do research, to others, and how much thought needs to go into giving more money directly to districts, to states, to others that actually are doing the work in the ground so they can support and fund research that meets their priorities. Because I feel like we're having all this conversation about funding, yet we're privileging ourselves. Almost everyone in the room is probably representing an institution that does research, as opposed to the organizations that we're trying to do research with, giving them more support and funding.
Yeah, Chris, I think there's no simple answer to that question. And that's why the committee recommended forming a working group to explore that very issue. I think that will take another 10 months, if not longer, to explore. It's a complicated issue because, of course, the research has to be done by the researchers.
Sure.
There are advantages to partnerships between researchers and school districts. Sometimes those do involve funds for the school district or whatever the targets of the research are. That's something that can be explored. But this is an issue that the committee was not able to come to a resolution on. And so consequently, we recommended a working group to explore the issue.
Yes.
I think the other thing in terms of thinking about that is that there are other parts of the department that provide lots of money directly to schools. So the EIR program is actually, many of the applications that come in are directed to school districts. Their budget is 1.5 times ours, and in the legislation for 23 it is more than twice, right, in terms of that. So there is funding available, but not through IES. So I think that would be one way to think about it.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. Is it working? Okay.
Yeah, it'll come up.
It's voice activated.
Oh, I got
Yeah.
you. Okay, I want to go back actually to the previous question because I've been reflecting on it. So sorry, to not be responding to yours, but I've been sort of sitting here thinking about it. There's a couple of things I want to make sure that we get out on the table here, I guess. One is that one of the things the committee wants to be clear on is that rigor does not mean quantitative. And that you can do rigorous research that is quantitative, you can do rigorous research that is qualitative, you can be mixed methods, and you can do research that is quantitative that is not rigorous. And so I want to just be very clear as a statistician saying that I think it's very important for us to expand the kinds of methods that we use, and to do so not because we think only that we're trying to make those methods better, but because we also recognize that there are questions we cannot answer right now with quantitative methodology, that we need people of different skill sets and different research traditions to help us to solve these problems. And so I just want to make sure that that is that is very clear in what we're saying, that this is not a quantitative qualitative divide, which frankly, I'm bored by at this point. I'm so tired of this quantitative qualitative, this versus that kind of nonsense. The world needs both. We all have different skills. We have some big problems to solve. So maybe we can kind of maybe work together.
Good point.
That was a great segue into, I have actually a question about qualitative research. Actually, I have many questions. I'm Susan Jekulak. I work at the ICPSR, which I think many of you are aware of. It's a data archive, the largest social science data archive, and it's housed at the University of Michigan. And I guess I have a comment and a question. One comment is I wanted you to expand a little bit on rigorous qualitative research, or what you, if anyone has some thoughts about like what they would like to see more of. And in part that comes from my role, like I have several roles. I used to work in the federal government funding research projects, but we are at ICPS are really good, mostly good at quantitative, producing metadata and sharing quantitative data. And more recently, we have been working a lot more on qualitative data and finding how hard it is to, like, we want to like figure out ways to share qualitative data as well, because that's one of the ways to have rigor in science is transparency in research, transparency in data. And so we've been working, and there is a qualitative data repository at Syracuse that also works on this. But, thinking of, so developing metadata, making the data shareable and still confidential and still meaningful, but as well, there's all kinds of different kinds of, like because of technology, like there's more and more video data, which I would put in the category of qualitative data that we need to figure out how to share and describe and cite. And anyway, so that's one of the, I just bring that up as a comment that's something that is going to come with rigor in qualitative research, is thinking about how to make qualitative data, more transparent. How do you share it and make it transparent and so that's one thing we're thinking about. Anyway, so qualitative data, I would love to hear a little bit more expansion on directions for that.
This is a great question. I am clearly not a qualitative researcher, but what I want to say is that this is why we, one of our recommendations was to add a panel and an RFA that focuses on this. So there's been a rich tradition at IES of having methods grants, and they have quantitative methods grants. And over time, as a result, there have been the ability to figure out how to study those methods, how to study when they work, when they don't work, how to provide guidance to the field on best practices, how to create trainings on best practices, all of that. And so this seems to me a place in which we could grow in that direction here as well, as sort of elevating what are good standards for good qualitative research. How is somebody from the outside supposed to know some guidelines for best practice or training opportunities, et cetera. So I think part of what we're asking for is to build an infrastructure to answer the question that you just asked. But I want to pass this to Janelle, who actually is a qualitative researcher.
Hello, I'm the qualitative researcher here. I want to amplify some of the points Beth made a few minutes ago, I think, which were very clear. That there was consensus on the panel that quality and rigor does not exist in one methodological tradition, and cutting across all of our recommendations is a response to, or is a desire to be more responsive to what the field knows and can do, and how IES can better support that. And so we see an opportunity to build and amplify and even exemplify the rigor that does exist in qualitative methods through the RFA process, right? Through the topics, through all of the recommendations that we've been made, so that it's not necessarily separate, but more integrated in the way that so many of the quantitative methods have been over the past 20 years.
If I could just add one site, in 2006, the culmination of a multi-method task force led ARA to issue standards for reporting on research methods most commonly used in the social sciences that explicates what counts for well-warranted and transparent research. And it was a love of labor that really sets forth that template in a way that actually shaped and had a role in the IES NSF Joint Standards for Evaluation. And so there's much more false dichotomy here. As Gloria Latson-Billings said, she was tired of this conversation too. And in most of the social sciences, we've long recognized that we need to well move beyond this. The first archive, data archive in the United States, is the Human Area Relations Files, founded in 1929, which is a qualitative repository of qualitative ethnographic research that has really shaped a great deal of ethnography. And we really, ARA seeks to lead in this area, and we'll have many fora on this, and that should really distract from the heart of what this report can offer the federal scientists who really need the support to have the resources, absolutely, but to have the resources to do the fine work that I think in very short order set of PowerPoints is an excellent template for us to begin. Let me see if we can get one more question in.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah Rim Kaufman. I'm at University of Virginia, and I recognize a few of you. Nice to see you. I want to say, first of all, thank you. I was so excited to hear about your impression of the training grants, having led those since 2004. I was just thrilled to hear. I see those as a gift that keep on giving in our field. It's incredible to see what trainees are doing. My real question for you all is about innovation and then research on that innovation. And one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is the way that kids slip into certain spaces. So the experience of a student in school slipping into regular education to special education and back again, or an intervention that's related to math that has a lot of social emotional learning implications. If the child could manage their anxiety better, they would be better able to do this intervention. And I think about those spaces, and I think, well, some people might call that treatment heterogeneity, but it's also the way our systems are based, that we aren't always thinking whole child or whole adult approaches. And I'm so curious, because you're in this position where you can incentivize certain types of thinking. Are there ways that you're thinking about incentivizing whole child approaches?
Anyone? Go ahead, Beth. And Joan?
No, if you have a report issue, you should take it. I was going to take it from.
Oh, I'll just say from the report perspective.
That's what, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. Like,
Yeah.
this report can incentivize the funding. Yeah,
I don't know that we articulated it in exactly that way, but in the report, we talk a lot about systems and about interventions that focus only on bringing in this intervention into the school or that intervention into the school don't seem to recognize the schooling context and the system in which it's going in. And so this is sort of part of what we're asking the field to be looking at schools and school practices and systems, also in the needs assessment part of this structure, that we're being more attuned to how interventions actually occur in the natural state of affairs in schools. The other place that you could see that is in the adaptation part of the development and adaptation, is this recognition that interventions we develop will be adapted to the environment. That actually is how they're picked up. And so which adaptations are good and which ones aren't good. And so all of these are saying, like, let's think about these interventions and now actually think about how they will work in a real school. And so I think that gets a little bit to what you're saying. That's at least how we were conceiving of this problem.
Okay, great, thank you.
Christy, did you have one question that came from, I'm sure you have more than one, but at least we'll have one from our virtual participants?
Yes, so I think the first question might have been one more for Adam, but building kind of on Mark's comment earlier about knowledge mobilization, kind of a better understanding of how to define that. And then the second question that we received was one regarding the recent solicitation for some of the assessment, evaluation, statistics, activities that are contracted out by IES, and how some of the report recommendations may be implemented in the course of, however that solicitation ends up rolling out, the PRESTO solicitation. Thank you.
I can respond to the first of those questions. The report documents use and usefulness of evidence is a key issue that needs to be addressed. To address that issue, we need to mobilize knowledge. By knowledge mobilization, we mean three activities. One, synthesizing existing evidence and preparing it for specific contexts. Two, producing new evidence on how research is used in schools, school districts, community colleges, early childhood centers, any education settings. And three, studying robust strategies to get evidence used, because it turns out evidence doesn't get used just because it's dropped from the trees, even if it's timely, relevant, and accessible. And so we need to study specific strategies to get evidence used. We need both descriptive and hypothesis testing research to examine those specific strategies. So that's what we mean by knowledge mobilization.
So I am actually going to conclude and suggest that the second set of issues about RFAs and so forth, Mark is in a conversation to talk about the state of where IES is and going, a moderated discussion with Kenji Okuda at 1:15 to 2:15. And we invite those virtual and those place-based to join that session. But in conclusion, I just want to say how far we've come at IES, its significance, and how far this report can enable IES to move to the next stage. There were other reports. AERA had one in 2009 or 10 that on the reauthorization of IES, that's about resources, resources, resources. We know how important resources are, but we know also that together we can make change that is instrumental, that also can drive and attract resources, and we need to work on that agenda. Thank you for coming. Continue to be involved. This isn't just a one-off. This is a way of doing and knowing together, and we invite your collaboration, your participation. My colleagues inside of government and who did this heavy lifting, Mark was right, it's a big, heavy lift. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Keep doing it.